G'day guys, Dean from Blog for the Blood God here, and Warhammer 40k has to be one of the more complex and more crazy tabletop war games that there is, with the amount of books and codexes that you need to be updated with the FAQs, with all of the changes, with the balanced data slates and all of the updates that come through. It can be very difficult to keep up with all of the changes on top of all the complex rules that you get from all of the different codexes and the supplements and all of those sorts of things. And as a result, we all make mistakes. We all make honest mistakes on a relatively regular basis. So what I want to talk about today is when your opponent makes a mistake in a Warhammer 40k tournament setting, what my opinion on the best way to approach that situation. So this is something that comes up a lot, and I know a lot of you that are watching this are either relatively new to the tournament scene, which is a growing scene, and it's absolutely amazing to see that growth. However, with that growth, I think we need a little bit of guidance and a little bit of an outline on how to handle those sorts of delicate and tricky situations when somebody makes a mistake. Because sometimes these mistakes can be quite pivotal and quite critical, and other times they're a little bit less important. So navigating the nuances of how to interact with your opponent when they make a mistake is really important. So I want to share some of my experience from my 10 plus years at Warhammer 40k tournaments and go through some of the ways that I think these situations are best handled. So without further ado, let's get straight into the episode.
Blog for the Blood God.
G'day guys, so let's have a bit of a discussion about what to do if your opponent gets a rule wrong and you're at a tournament. Now, this is a very nuanced subject, and I think there's a lot of different ways that you need to be able to approach this situation, because it's going to vary depending on the severity of their rule and the severity of the consequences of their mistake. So it's important to note from the outset that we all get rules wrong. It's very human, and 40k is a very complex game. So there needs to be at least a baseline assumption of innocent until proven guilty. Too often you see people immediately jump to the cheater accusation when somebody gets a rule wrong. And this could be, by rule wrong, I mean this could be anything from, thinking that something has a certain statistic that it doesn't, like it might be thinking it has 5 wounds when it actually has 4, or thinking that something is strength 6 when it's actually strength 7, or something like that. Or you've just got one of the stats wrong. Or it could be something like forgetting that something has a stratagem that's core only, and you just use it on something that's not core or whatever, right? There's infinite ways that you can get something wrong in 40k. It's such a complex game, you'll fuck shit up all the time. Not only that, it's constantly getting new releases, so there's always going to be new things coming on board that take time to learn and understand and those sorts of things. So you have to have a baseline level of, assumptions of innocence. That being said, some mistakes can be quite egregious, and some mistakes can be quite consequential. And if you make a mistake that gives you a significant advantage, then it's fair for your opponent to want some kind of significant, consequence for that. So that's what I want to talk about today, is basically some of the different reasons and some of the different consequences that I think should be in play for situations where a player makes a mistake at a tournament. So I guess the first thing to touch on is the first thing to touch on will be when the mistake is identified. That's probably the most important part, right? Because if the mistake is identified really early in the game, and therefore it wasn't able to have that big of an impact, well, then you just nip it in the bud. You just go, cool. Well, for example, they shoot at you, you roll your saves, they're like, it's AP2, and you're like, yep, cool. So you roll all your saves, a bunch of guys die, and then immediately after you realize, or in the next turn, you realize that it was actually only AP1, right? A pretty easy fix there is to just go, okay, cool. Well, you killed 6 guys and I was rolling 4 up saves, but I should have been rolling 3 up saves. So therefore you probably would have only killed 4 or 3 guys, and you can just return those models to the unit to correct that previous mistake. And then you're good to go, right? You've fixed it. And I think it's important to note in these situations, if you are the one that made the mistake, you need to offer that to your opponent willingly and generously. So if they think they would have lost, say in that example, they lost 6 guys, and they say, I would have only lost 2, even if statistically speaking, they would have lost, 3 or 4, you have to kind of go, okay, well, I fucked up. The onus is on me to make amends here. So give them back their 4 models and say, cool, you only lost 2. It's because by being generous with your paying your reparations, I guess, you're sort of proving that it wasn't intentional cheating. Because if you intentionally cheated, you would then fight it and try to maintain that advantage that you gained by getting that rule wrong. Whereas if you're like, holy shit, I'm so sorry, I fucked that up. They used to be AP2 and I forgot about the new changes in the codex, or they used to be whatever the reason is that you made that mistake, because there's always going to be a reason, or you just might have been thinking of a different weapon. Either way, you go, well, I fucked up, I need to make this better, so what can I do to make it better? So that's what you do if you discover the mistake during the game. Obviously, the further back the mistake is, like if it's 2 turns ago and he's done 2 turns worth of damage, it then becomes obviously more difficult the longer it goes. But even then, if it's 2 turns ago, you, as the player who made the mistake, you need to be generous in your efforts to make it right. And this goes for anything from like maybe you were taking damage and you were passing on a save that you shouldn't have, or they were wounding on 5s because they thought you were toughness 6, but it turns out you're only toughness 5, and therefore they would have been wounding you on 4s. Well, then you just have to go, okay, cool, I'll just put an extra 5 wounds on that model, or I'll just remove 2 more models because you would have been wounding more. And I think if you offer that up early, then it really does go a long way to showing that you're owning that mistake and that you're, trying to make things better. Never ever fight it, and never ever push for that sort of stuff. If your opponent does push back, like if they make a mistake and you say, okay, well, I would like to return 5 models to my unit because I think you wouldn't have killed that many, and they say no, that's when you get a TO. And the TO will probably enforce something. But the other reason that you want to get the TO involved at that stage is because now the TO is aware that that player has made a mistake. And if that player makes another similar mistake later in the event, well, then there's a justification for a yellow card or even a red card, depending on the severity of the mistake. So notifying the TO of those sorts of errors is really important, just because it allows the TO to maintain consistency, and it also allows the TO to penalize anybody who does that frequently, because I guess that's the other side to the coin, is you need to give people benefit of the doubt. However, if they're consistently making mistakes, well, that benefit of the doubt starts to decay, and you do start to approach a point where it's like, well, actually, the problem is you. The problem isn't the game is complex. The problem is that you aren't putting in sufficient effort to comprehend that complexity. So if your opponent's making, it's just like, if your opponent's making lots of mistakes, it's like, well, that's almost culpability, right? They shouldn't be making that many mistakes. You're allowed to make a couple, everybody does. But yes, some people will, I guess one of the challenges is some people feel that because it's okay to make a couple of mistakes, they will intentionally get a couple of things wrong and then claim the defense of, oh, it was just a mistake, and that's why it's important to let the TOs know when somebody does make a mistake, because then the TO will be aware of it, and then if that TO gets multiple reports of the same person making mistakes, well, then the TO can do something about it. So basically, pretty much any time your opponent makes a mistake, I would let the TO know, even if you don't need the TO to intervene. So if your opponent makes a mistake, but then they like, oh, I fucked up, I thought it was T5, but I'm only T4, so I guess I'll kill a couple more of my models because you would have killed more, right? You still want to let the TO know, but I would wait until after the game, because the player has taken it on themselves to resolve that challenge, so they've fixed it. But then you just let the TO know, oh, just so you know, I played fucking, John Smith or whatever, Mr. Generic name. I played him, he got this rule wrong. It's all good, we fixed it, but I just wanted you to be aware so that if he makes mistakes in future games with other players, then you can do something about it. And you just let the TO know. And your TO might just go, yeah, cool, whatever, I don't care. Or the TO might go, well, in my events, that's worth a warning or something like that. So you just let the TO know so that they can make the best decision that they want. But then we get into the more muddy area, which is what if your opponent makes a significant mistake that impacts the outcome of the game and you don't realize until after the game. And this is where it gets really, really tricky, and a lot of factors have to go into deciding what you do in this situation. So first you have to determine, did it really impact the game? And the best way to do this is to actually look at the scoreboard, look at the points, and try to figure out, would you have gotten any other secondaries had they not got this wrong? Would you have gotten any more primary had they not gotten this wrong? Like not but I would have killed more shit. Well, it's like, that's not points, that doesn't impact the scoreboard, right? So you look at the scoreboard and it's like, if you look at it and you're like, well, I took behind enemy lines, I took psychic ritual, and I took raise the banners, right? And it's like, cool, if they were rolling something as toughness 5 when it was actually toughness 4, that wouldn't have impacted any of those scores, because behind enemy lines wouldn't have mattered, banners wouldn't have mattered, like it wouldn't have impacted your secondaries, right? And then you look at it and you're like, well, if I had killed that unit, a turn earlier, would I have actually gained any additional primary score? Would that have changed? And if you look at all of those things and you be realistic and you go, okay, cool, I maybe would have gone better, but I still wouldn't have won. Like, instead of being them getting a 90 and me getting a 70, it might have been they got a 90 or they got like an 85 and I got like a 75, like they're still gonna win. So if they're still gonna win, regardless of whether or not, regardless of the severity of the mistake, regardless of, any of that shit, they were still gonna win the game, well then you still wanna notify the TO, and you want to talk to your opponent and say, look, mate, we played earlier in the event, or even if it's at the end of the game and you're putting in the scores and that's when you realize it. You say, look, you fucked up a rule. I think, honestly, that I would have gotten more points and you would have gotten less. If you tell your opponent, like, I don't think I was going to beat you, I think I just would have gotten more points, they're almost certainly going to say, okay, let's revise those scores to what they should have been. Right? As long as you're being reasonable and as long as you're being honest about it, most players are reasonable, and they'll go, oh yes, okay, fair enough, I'll reduce my score from 90 to 95 to 85, and I'll improve your score from 70 to 75, because that's fair. And then you just let the TO know, this is what we've done because this is the situation. Most TOs will be like, yes, that's fair, and then off you go. The challenge is, what happens if you think that you genuinely believe you would have won the game had they not fucked that rule up, And things like, maybe they use a stratagem and they only pay 1 CP when it actually costs 2. Which it's worth noting that there will be situations where people make mistakes that hurt them as well. And what do you do in that situation? If they make a mistake that hurts them and therefore they lose the game, nobody would think that they can then say, oh, well, if I hadn't made that mistake, I would have won, so therefore I want to revert the scores so that I win. So we're only talking about situations here where they make a mistake that gives them an advantage. But say, so for example, in the recent tournament, I was spending 2 CP for one of the Alpha Legion stratagems that actually only costs 1 CP. So I was fucking myself out of a CP every game because I thought it cost 2 CP to do that, and it actually only cost 1. So people make mistakes in both directions, so you've got to just take that on board. And that's part of the reason why I suggest not jumping straight to the cheater accusation, because you know, it's just hard to prove their intent like that. But yeah, back onto the topic of what happens if they make a mistake that actually costs you the game and that you would have won had they not. And that becomes really tricky because it's difficult to prove that you would have won, right? Because you could have argued all kinds of things. So I think that's the situation where you have to get a TO involved. You have to bring a TO over to the table and explain the situation and explain, okay, he had XYZ rule, but that rule actually doesn't apply to these units and he was using it on those units. He told me that it did apply to those units, so therefore the decisions that I made during the game were bad because I was avoiding those units, but turns out those units didn't have that rule, blah, 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 right? And then you literally lay out your case as concisely and honestly as you can. And then your opponent gets to lay out their case, and then the TO has to make the decision. And this is one of the reasons why I fucking hate being a TO, because it's fucking annoying because you have to make these difficult calls. Because the problem with this call for the TO is if they rule in your favor and you now get the win and your opponent gets the loss, your opponent's going to be pretty salty, right? Because they will probably argue, no, I don't think I would have lost anyway. I don't think the mistake was that important, you know. But you're going to be saying, yes, it was important. It did cost me the game. And then the TO has to make a decision. He's either going to piss your opponent off or he's going to piss you off. There's no scenario where the TO doesn't piss somebody off. And that's a shit spot for the TOs to be in. So I always recommend trying your hardest to resolve this between the players first. But if your opponent's being adamant that there's no way that they were going to lose, even if they didn't get this rule wrong, they were going to win regardless. If they're going in with that attitude, and you're going in saying, no, I absolutely would have won, well, then you kind of need the TO or the judge to come over and arbitrate and sort of come up with a conclusion to that situation. And generally speaking, I think my advice for TOs would be to rule in favor of the victim. So if somebody has made a mistake, they kind of have to accept whatever penalty gets thrown their way. And if that means that battle or that turn, you know, that round of the event gets turned into a loss, well, that's what it is. That's the price that you pay for making mistakes. And if TOs don't enforce that, well, you're actually incentivizing people to intentionally make mistakes because there's no penalty. So I think TOs actually need to enforce harsh penalties on people who make mistakes, but they also need to you need to show a little bit of, mercy as well, because people will make genuine, honest mistakes. So it's just little things like, okay, cool, maybe we call it a loss, but only a 1 point loss. You know, so if the original scores were 90 to 82, and you're like, I definitely would have gotten 8 more points, and he wouldn't have got all of the points he got, so I think I would have won. Well, you just revert the scores. You make it you put yourself up to a 90, but put them to like an 89, you know? So you're penalizing them, you're giving them the loss, but you're not just completely eviscerating their score. So you just give them the loss, you give the other guy the win, but the smallest possible win, just to make them happy. And you give the player who made the mistake a warning, but you don't have to card them, you don't have to make a big song and dance about it, because they've just taken the penalty of the loss. They'll take that and they'll learn their lesson. Well, hopefully, in theory. I think, going, oh, well, we're going to yellow card you and we're going to give you a penalty that applies to your overall tournament placings, and we're going to fucking, you're on a record now as somebody who made, I think those things are a bit much. on a first offense basis, right? And then we get into the next level of challenge, where what happens if you have a player who is consistently making mistakes? What do you do in that situation? And I really do think that you need to talk to the TOs. If he's at an event and he makes several mistakes in that event, he needs to be yellow carded, and then if he continues to make mistakes, red carded and ejected from the event. And then TOs need to talk amongst themselves and just let other TOs know of this behavior, so that if he then goes to another tournament and makes the same mistakes, then you have a justification to actually put a community-wide ban out, because this guy is clearly intentionally making mistakes. We've had people in the past where I've found that they got a rule wrong in a game against me, and I corrected them, and I was like, oh, you got that wrong. And they're like, oh shit, I did too, my bad. And I was like, yep, no worries, mate, we all make mistakes. And I was really forgiving. And then after the game, I was talking to someone and they're like, he made the same mistake against me and I corrected him. And I'm like, oh, so you told him that he can't do that and you played him on round 2, and then I played him on round 3 and he did it again, knowing that he couldn't do it? Well, that's cheating. So that's where you go, okay, TO, call the TO over, that's a fucking red card, eject this guy from the event, because that's proven that he cheated. So I think the potential for harsh penalties needs to be there. The potential to eject somebody from the event because they made a mistake that they knew about needs to be there, but I think it should be used sparingly. Like, it needs to exist, but don't jump to that conclusion the first time somebody makes a mistake. If they make a mistake, you don't jump to the cheating conclusion. You just go, okay, cool, what can we do to fix this mistake? You know, do we bump up your score a little bit? Do we change it to a loss? What do we need to do? Do I return some models to a unit? Do I take some more wounds on one of my things? Like, what do we need to do to fix this mistake? You know, like if they spend 1 CP on a 2 CP stratagem and you realize in the next turn, well, we notch them down. And if you're like, oh, well, that actually would have meant you would have been at zero CP, so you wouldn't have been able to re-roll that save that you re-rolled in the following turn, so take more damage on that other unit. Like, you can retroactively figure these things out and just be fair and reasonable and generous if you're the one that made the mistake. So you do those things, that resolves it, but you keep an eye out for repeat behavior. And this is the onus is on all players at a tournament to do this. The community itself needs to regulate this stuff. You can't expect the TOs to do everything. So you need to tell people about it. You need to talk about it. Talk about it in a generous way, though. Like, don't be like, oh, I played so-and-so and he fucking cheated and it cost me the game. Just be like, yeah, I played so-and-so, you know, he made an honest mistake and unfortunately that cost us the game. But he was generous in his, you know, preparations. He fixed it. So we're all good, but let people know that mistakes were made, you know. And because we're all going to make them, so it's fine. You know, nobody should be judging anybody harshly for making mistakes, because if you do that, when you eventually make a mistake, you're going to be destroyed as well. So just share the information so that people are aware of it, and that way the community itself can regulate whether or not that person's going to make repeat mistakes and therefore be able to be identified as somebody who's potentially trying to leverage the fact that mistakes get made in order to gain an unfair advantage. Yeah, so that's my sort of thoughts on how to handle a tournament situation where somebody makes a genuine mistake. I think the key here is to keep an eye out for repeat behavior and penalize that, but don't particularly penalize one-off offenses, because they are, by and large, often they are innocent, honest mistakes. Yeah, so I'm going to leave you there, and thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Cheers.
Alrighty guys, I hope you found that informative, and I hope you enjoyed that content. Let me know if you did in the comments below, and let's get a conversation going about what you think you would do if your opponent made a mistake. Maybe share some examples in the comments below of mistakes your opponents have made, or maybe even mistakes that you've made, because we've all made these mistakes, and the only way that we can grow as a community is if we own our mistakes, accept our mistakes, and accept our opponent's mistakes when appropriate. So with that being said, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you again to all my lovely supporters on Patreon. You guys have inspired me to go balls deep into this project of YouTube, and really inspired me to just dig deep and generate as much content for you guys as I can, provided the content is of high quality. So your support has allowed me to do that. It's allowed me to justify some of the expenses, and I very much appreciate that. So thank you again to all my supporters on Patreon. For those of you who haven't signed up on Patreon, I also have a private Discord in there where we talk lists and strategies and all those sorts of things. There's a few different tiers. Some of them include one-on-one coaching sessions with myself. So if that's something that you're interested in, check me out on Patreon. There's a link in the description below, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Cheers.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel